McLuhan was very keen, sort of his special area of expertise was print, and he was very keen to sort of tease apart the impact of print on the Western mind from its inception to the present. And he concluded basically that we are essentially print-created people, or at least the people of his generation were, and that all of the institutions of Western culture that we unquestioningly give our loyalty to are in fact peculiar adaptations sanctioned and made inevitable by print. He saw the uniformity and linearity of print as permitting such things as the concept of the nation state, democracy. After all, isn't democracy a notion of interchangeable parts, all of the one man, one vote concept? This is an idea which McLuhan felt only made sense inside a print culture. He talked about what he called sensory ratios being subtly shifted by the introduction of new technologies. In some of his more specific predictions, he proved himself to be as culture-bound and capable of absurdity as any of the things he was criticizing. But I think in his general approach to things, he was pretty spot on. And any information transforming medium can be treated this way. In Understanding Media, McLuhan talks about the electric light as a form of media. He never wrote about psychedelics, but certainly psychedelics transform the sensory ratios and the modalities of perception. I would argue that what psychedelics do is they are, in a sense, deconditioning agents. And what they wipe out is local forms of conditioning. Culture. Culture is something more and more that I like to talk about. And I've sort of gone down a line of thinking that is not very PC, but that gives me a lot of intellectual relief from the agony of my life. And I suspect it might work for other people too. It's the concept that culture is not your friend, and that we need to get right up front about this, about how culture is not your friend. The role of culture in the lives of societies has changed in the 20th century. We all live too long now to be duped by culture in the way that previous populations were. If the average member of a population only lives to age 40, the cultural con can go on and on and on. But if you give people lifespans into the 80s, then they get 40 years to think about what they went through between 0 and 40, and eventually they'll figure out just who and what screwed them. And when they do, they are not going to be very happy with the cultural values that they attempted to come to terms with and work through. I was thinking about how I would talk about this tonight, and though we've been talking about these kinds of ideas in the staff teaching all week, I didn't realize till this afternoon what a frontal assault this concept is on one of the most cherished notions that has flourished around this place, which is the idea of the inner child. And I realized that really what I was about was not the inner child, but a quite different program, overcoming culturally induced neoteny. Neoteny is a biological phenomenon that we will also this weekend talk about as a sociological phenomenon. Neoteny is the retention of juvenile characteristics into adulthood. It's a strategy in biology. For instance, our hairlessness is a neonatal trait, evolutionarily speaking. All primates are born hairless, but we retain this into adulthood. The ratio of our skull to our torso in adult human beings is a fetal ratio when compared to other primates. And I'm fascinated by the question, and Dennis and I got into an argument in our hotel room because we both spoke at a conference a week ago where I said this, and he said, well, is all culture have this infantile and juvenilizing property, or is there something specifically pathological about Western culture? And at first I was willing to argue that all culture does this, makes children of its members. But I think to some degree it's true that all culture is somewhat unfriendly to the individual. When their heavy arm falls on your shoulder and they tell you that you're going to be sent off to some foreign hellhole to kill people as a young man, you definitely suddenly get the notion that culture is not your friend. But perhaps, if you're a 12-year-old boy in an Amazonian tribe and they announce that now it's time for the 2-week abandonment in the woods, from which if you live to tell the tale, you'll become a full member of society, I'm not sure those kids greet that with a leap of joy in their hearts. It's like, oh my God, now this. We knew it was coming. I went through rites of passage like that were excruciating. Where I grew up in Western Colorado, you weren't a real man unless sometime between 12 and 16 you killed an elk. Hunting season every October was an excuse for this insane rite of passage, and my father was an unquestioning inhabitant of his culture, and so this was always in front of me. And when I was, when I was 12, I went the first time. I didn't get anything. The second year we went out, and my father, I'm sure, had no idea what a wilted pansy I was in this situation, because I had hid it from him. I was concerned about all kinds of things, and eventually this situation arose where they put me up on this point and gave me a gun and said if anything came by to blow it away. And by God, this thing, chose to sacrifice itself as far as I could tell. I mean, it did not behave at all like elk behave. It basically just came out of the woods, stood still. I pulled down on it, closed my eyes, prayed. There was an enormous noise. When I opened my eyes, there was nothing whatsoever to be seen. I felt an enormous relief that this thing had escaped, and walked over to find it dead as a doornail. And, the oak leaves dipped in the blood, the cup of blood, the whole thing. I mean, I couldn't believe how atavistic this stuff was. However, I never had to please my father again. I was home free. Everything was forgiven from that moment on. But it brought home to me how uncomfortable culture is, and always has been, I think, and is getting more so. This is something that's going on because of a hellish marriage between psychology and modern advertising. The game of manipulation, the stakes are rising because market analysis and behavioral forms of psychology and treatment of large numbers of people have created an enormous capacity to reach people with commercial messages and manipulate their lives. Yeah, did you want to say something?
Were you saying that this print-created idea extends into all kinds of things, and television and radio also, and the internet? And I didn't...
No. See, what McLuhan was saying was that he didn't live to see the internet, but he talked a great deal about television, and he felt that television would destroy the print-created world, and I think he was right to some degree. Television is a completely different creature. It's very physiologically involving. It's hard to see it. You have to look at it. And McLuhan talked a lot when he talked about print. He contrasted it with manuscript culture, which is what culture in the Middle Ages was. And he pointed out that in manuscript culture, you do not read manuscripts. You look at them and you figure out what they say because you're unfamiliar with the handwriting style. In print, especially in the early years of print, there were a very limited number of fonts, and every lowercase a was made to look as much like every other lowercase a as possible. So this new function comes into being called reading, and reading is a very specialized form of looking. Thomas Aquinas was, or was it St. Augustine? I can never remember. But anyway, one of these fathers of the church, he would prove his sanctity to doubters by having them open books of scripture in front of him. And he would look at these pages of scripture, and then they would close the book and ask him what was there, and he could tell you. And they thought it proved that he was a saint. He was the only man in Europe who could read silently. He was the first European to be able to read silently. Now, this is a ubiquitous skill among us. And in fact, if you move your lips while you read, it probably indicates that English is a second language for you. I recall, I think it's in Pale Fire, Nabokov sneers. He says, I didn't write for people who move their lips when they read. The high culture, right? A literature, looking down at the sense ratios induced in peons. And the very notion of high culture is a print-created notion. I think the psychedelic thing has a claim to being a new paradigm simply because it doesn't offer ideology at all. It says, no, what has happened is civilization has lost touch with a certain category of experience. And in the absence of this experience, mistakes are being made, juvenile mistakes. And this leads me back to this theme of neoteny. Culture is a plot to keep you childish, to keep you dependent, to keep you deluded, to keep your eyes fixed where they shouldn't be, on goals that are trivial, demeaning, ultimately unsatisfying. I don't know how we can directly reverse this except by a concentrated effort to examine our first premises and grow up. And it's there's a lot of youth bashing that goes on in this culture. We're told that the Gen Xers are shiftless, druggy, gender confused, so forth and so on. This rap against neoteny is not directed at youth. They are young. They have that excuse. You only get it once in your life, but you should use it as often as possible because it will soon be pulled from your grip. But it's preposterous for middle-aged people and people past middle age to try and use this same out. What is their excuse for their childishness, their cluelessness, their fetishes, addictions, and intellectual shortcuts that flatten and simplify the world and turn it into an epistemological cartoon? I mean, that's it's sloppy thinking. It means that you're actually in flight from the richness of experience.